Paternity probability, 99.99%. The judge's voice echoed through the room as the man remained motionless, but his fingers gripped the armchair's armrest until they turned white. The mistress beside him averted her gaze to the floor, as if searching for an invisible exit on the cold marble tiles. The pregnant woman, who weeks earlier had collapsed in that very courtroom under the weight of the accusations, now took a deep breath and felt something different. It wasn't relief, not yet victory. It was just the first loose thread of a plot she now realized was much larger, much darker than she had ever imagined. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10, and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The day had dawned gray, as if the sky anticipated the weight of what was to come. Beatrice entered the courtroom with slow steps, her hand resting on her 7-month pregnant belly, feeling every movement of her daughter within her as a reminder that she wasn't alone, even if the world around her seemed to conspire to make her believe otherwise. Every gaze she met in the cold marble hallway seemed to carry judgment. They weren't just curious looks. They were looks that already held a verdict. She felt their weight like stones cast in silence. In the last 3 months, ever since Henry had abruptly and publicly filed for divorce, she had ceased to be the devoted wife and had become that woman. Stories circulated through the company hallways where he worked, through the mutual friend circles that once embraced her and now averted their gaze, through messages from relatives who cut off contact without even asking for her side of the story. It was as if she had been erased and replaced by a distorted version of herself, a fictional character created by Henry's narrative. She cheated on her husband, the child isn't even his. She's trying to extort him. She got pregnant on purpose to secure alimony. Each version was more elaborate than the last, and all had a single source: Henry. He had turned the divorce into a public campaign, using his connections, his social standing, his circle of influence to construct a story that sounded credible because it came from someone respected, someone with power. Beatrice's lawyer, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman with a firm gaze and a measured voice who carried on her shoulders decades of experience defending women in similar situations, touched her shoulder before they entered the courtroom. Take a deep breath, Beatrice. Today is just the beginning. Remember, procedures exist to serve people, not to destroy them. That's the foundation of everything. Don't forget. The phrase sounded almost naive at that moment, almost like an empty comfort in the face of the approaching storm. Beatrice nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling of being led onto a stage where the script had already been written without her participation, where she was just an extra in her own story. When the courtroom door opened, the contrast was brutal. Henry was sitting beside his lawyer, Mr. Maxwell Sterling, a man of calculated gestures, impeccable posture, and a professorial tone that turned every phrase into a judgment. He was known in legal circles for never losing a case, for his ability to manipulate narratives and turn victims into villains with the same ease with which one turns a page. Beside Henry sat Clarissa, his new partner, too young for the air of ownership she displayed, as if the place she occupied was a legitimate conquest and not an invasion. She wore an impeccable wine-colored pantsuit, high heels that echoed confidence, and smiled with studied discretion, like someone who knows she's being watched and wants to project the image of a winner. Beatrice sat on the hard bench, felt the cold air conditioning chilling her skin, the heavy silence that precedes battles. The judge, Helen Carter, a middle-aged woman with her hair pulled back in a severe bun and discreet framed glasses, reviewed the documents unhurriedly, with the patience of someone who had seen 1,000 similar stories and learned not to be swayed by first impression. When she looked up, her expression was neutral, almost tired. But there was something in it that Beatrice couldn't decipher. Perhaps distrust, perhaps skepticism, perhaps just the weight of an entire career mediating human tragedy. "We may begin," said the judge, adjusting her glasses and opening the folder containing the case. Marcia Sterling rose with the confidence of someone who knows every comma of the process, every loophole in the law, every weak point of the adversary. He opened his genuine leather briefcase, adjusted his designer glasses, and took a sip of water as if preparing the ground for a rehearsed speech, then began. "Your Honor, we are facing a case that demands not only legal clarity, but moral firmness. My client, Mr. Henry Thompson, a businessman with a consolidated reputation in the real estate market, a philanthropist recognized for his contributions to the community, finds himself coerced by a situation he never imagined facing in his honorable life. During 15 years of marriage, he offered the defendant financial stability, social respect, and material comfort. In return, he was systematically and calculatedly betrayed. The pregnancy she claims is the fruit of the marriage is in fact the result of an extramarital affair she maintained for months, perhaps years. We have witnesses who confirm suspicious meetings at incompatible times with her allegations, messages exchanged with third parties whose names we prefer to withhold for now, and a pattern of behavior that does not align with the victim image she attempts to construct before this court. Beatrice felt her heart race. Blood rushed to her head, her breathing shortened. Each word was a calculated blow, each pause a silent stab. There was no proof of what he was saying because none of it was true. She had never betrayed Henry, had never even considered it. But the way M.R. Sterling presented the facts, with strategic pauses, sweeping gestures, a grave tone that filled the room, transformed lies into evidence, fiction into legal reality. My client requests, based on the facts presented, the suspension of any temporary alimony until paternity is irrefutably confirmed by a neutral forensic examination, as well as the immediate equitable division of assets, without favoritism based on unproven emotional claims. We further request that witnesses who can shed light on the defendant's inappropriate behavior during the period in question be heard. He paused dramatically, looked directly at Beatrice with an expression that mixed disdain and pity, then turned back to the judge. The defendant, Your Honor, has been using her pregnancy as an emotional shield, as a tool of manipulation. But justice is not made with sentimental appeals. It is made with facts, with documents, with verifiable testimony. And the facts, when presented in their totality, will reveal the true face of this situation. The room remained in absolute silence, as if everyone held their breath. Dr. Eleanor Vance scribbled something on her notepad with excessive force, but Beatrice could barely breathe. The air seemed to have been sucked out of the room. She felt the room spin slightly, the lights intensify, the sound become muffled. She tried to raise her hand to ask to speak, to say that none of it was true, but no voice came out. Her throat was constricted. The judge, without averting her gaze from the papers, asked if there was anything else to add. M.R. Sterling smiled faintly, a smile of contained satisfaction, and said no, that the facts spoke for themselves. That's when Dr. Eleanor Vance rose, pushing her chair back with controlled force. Your Honor, I request that the defendant be heard immediately. She has the constitutional right to respond to the accusations that have been made against her honor, her dignity, and her motherhood. The judge nodded with a brief gesture. Ms. Beatrice. You may speak. Beatrice tried to stand. She leaned on the heavy wooden table, felt her legs buckle as if her bones had dissolved. The air completely failed her. The room began to darken at the edges of her vision, as if a black tunnel were closing around her. She heard someone shout her name, felt hands gripping her shoulders, her arms, and then everything went black. When she woke, she was lying on the padded bench in the outer hallway, surrounded by court officers, her lawyer and a nurse taking her blood pressure with a worried expression. The hearing had been suspended. Henry and Clarissa had already left the building, she learned later, without even asking how she was. The judge had ruled that the proceedings would continue on a new date, but had demanded an immediate DNA test to resolve any doubt about paternity. Beatrice looked at the white ceiling of the hallway, with its cold fluorescent lights, and felt something strange emerge from deep within her chest. It wasn't despair, it wasn't fear anymore, it was rage, a cold, crystalline, lucid rage, which told her with absolute clarity that this wouldn't end like this. In the days following the collapse in court, Henry's narrative spread through the town with surgical efficiency, as if it were a military operation planned in minute detail. Interviews strategically leaked to local gossip and news sites. Anonymous but clearly orchestrated comments on social media. Carefully drafted messages sent to mutual acquaintances. Everything constructed to reinforce the same story. Beatrice was the villain, the manipulator, the woman who had betrayed a good man. He, in turn, was the victim worthy of compassion. Dr. Eleanor Vance tried to block some publications through cease and desist letters and content removal requests, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. For every post removed, 3 new ones appeared on different platforms, with minor variations but always reinforcing the same core narrative. Henry had extensive contacts, abundant financial resources, and above all, a cohesive narrative that sounded true because it was repeated tirelessly. Beatrice, on the other hand, was confined to absolute medical bed rest after the episode in court. The obstetrician had been clear. Any additional stress, any significant emotional elevation could seriously compromise the pregnancy. She was at risk of premature labor. She needed silence, peace, rest. But how could she rest when her name was being publicly destroyed? How could she find peace when every phone notification could bring another accusation, another lie shared 1,000 times? It was during this period of forced isolation, of heavy silence and contained rage, that she began to perceive the fissures in Henry's seemingly perfect narrative. Small inconsistencies that alone seemed insignificant, but together began to form a pattern. One Sunday afternoon, while reviewing old papers stored in boxes in the closet, marriage certificates, birth certificates, photos of family events, search of something, anything that could help in her defense, she found a photo album of Henry's family. There were records of luxurious corporate parties, formal dinners with dignitaries, award ceremonies where he received trophies and honors. In one of the photos, dated 10 years earlier, Henry was beside his father, Arthur Thompson, a renowned businessman who had built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire, owning dozens of developments across the state. Beatrice looked at the image with renewed attention, something she had never done before. Something didn't fit. She clearly remembered a conversation years ago, during a Christmas dinner at her mother-in-law's house, when Mrs. Thompson had said something jokingly, with that somewhat tipsy and expansive manner she had after her third glass of wine. Henry is just like his father. Even their eyes are the same color, same shape. Genetics don't lie. But in the photo, looking closely at the details that had previously gone unnoticed, their eyes were completely different. Arthur had clear, blue-green, almond-shaped eyes. Henry had dark brown, almost black, round eyes. A small detail, insignificant to most people, but enough to plant a persistent doubt in the mind of someone who was beginning to question everything. She picked up the phone with trembling hands and called Dr. Eleanor Vance. The lawyer answered after 3 rings, her voice worried. "Beatrice, is everything all right? You should be resting. I need you to investigate something for me," Beatrice said, ignoring the recommendation. Her voice was firm for the first time in weeks. "I need you to investigate the origin of Henry's inheritance, his relationship with his father. I need to know if something is wrong there, Doctor." Eleanor Vance hesitated for a few long seconds. "Beatrice, this is extremely delicate. We could be opening a dangerous line of inquiry if we find nothing. He could use it against us, claim we are making unfounded accusations to divert attention." "I know," Beatrice replied, looking at the photo again, "but there's something wrong. I can't explain it rationally, but I feel it deep in my soul. There's something rotten at the foundation of this family. Something he's hiding, Doctor." Eleanor Vance agreed, but imposed a firm condition. They would hire a specialized forensic accountant, and someone capable of tracking not only tax and banking documents, but financial behavior patterns, hidden structures, suspicious movements, someone who knew where to look when all official paths seemed blocked or too clean. The name recommended by a trusted colleague was Marcus Rivers, a man in his 50s, prematurely bald, thick-lensed glasses, and a meticulous gaze that seemed to catalog every detail of the environment. He accepted the case after listening to Beatrice for just 15 minutes in a virtual meeting that took place on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. "I've seen similar stories before," he said, quickly jotting something down on his tablet with a stylus pen. "Powerful men build elaborate narratives because they know, from experience or instinct, that well-told narratives replace truths when there's no one to firmly challenge. But every construct has a foundation. And every foundation, no matter how solid it seems, can be audited, investigated, deconstructed. It's a matter of method, patience, and correct access to records." While Marcus began the meticulous investigative work requesting certificates, cross-referencing IRS data, analyzing property records, tracing offshore companies, Beatrice faced another emotional challenge: the DNA test. The procedure was carried out in a neutral and aseptic clinic, with strict supervision from judicial experts appointed by the judge. Henry appeared punctually at the scheduled time with Clarissa by his side, both displaying the same posture of someone who already knew the result and was merely fulfilling an inconvenient bureaucratic formality. Beatrice, contrary to everything she had felt in the previous weeks, was calm. For the first time in months, she felt she had something Henry couldn't control, manipulate, or distort. The biological truth inscribed in DNA, irrefutable and absolute. The results would take 2 weeks to be ready. Enough time for Marcus Rivers to begin to discover what no one should ever know, what was buried under decades of false documents and complex legal structures. The second hearing was scheduled for a rainy Thursday in October, with cold winds announcing the arrival of winter. Beatrice entered the courtroom with firm steps, her now 8-month pregnant belly prominent, but her posture completely transformed. She was no longer the woman who had collapsed under pressure. She was someone who had found an inner axis, a determination that came not from despair, but from the certainty of being on the right path. Dr. Eleanor Vance carried a voluminous and heavy folder, filled with new documents that had been attached to the case in recent days. Marcus Rivers was present, sitting discreetly in the back rows of the room, wearing a subtle gray suit like a silent observer who prefers not to draw attention. Judge Helen Carter entered the room with a more serious expression than in the previous hearing. There was something different in her gaze, a sharper attention. She opened the session with protocolar formality and, without circumlocution, picked up the sealed envelope containing the forensic report. The silence in the room was absolute, as if time itself had stopped to witness that moment. Probability of paternity of Mr. Henry Thompson in relation to the fetus carried by Ms. Beatrice Santos, 99.99%. Conclusion. Paternity confirmed with maximum statistical certainty margin. The judge's voice was neutral, technical, but the impact of the words was devastating. Henry did not move for long seconds, as if his brain needed to process information that completely contradicted the narrative he had built. His hands gripped the arms of the chair until his knuckles turned white. Clarissa, sitting beside him, immediately lowered her gaze and crossed her arms defensively, as if to protect herself from something invisible. Sterling flicked through papers quickly, with nervous gestures as if searching for something to justify the unjustifiable, some technical loophole. Some procedural error? Beatrice allowed herself a deep sigh, but not one of complete relief. That was just the first step. The first wall had fallen, but she knew there were others, higher and more dangerous. The judge did not adjourn the hearing there. She consulted her notes and gave the floor to Dr. Eleanor Vance, who rose with studied calm, adjusting her blazer and taking a deep breath before speaking. Your Honor, the paternity test definitively confirms what has always been true, that Ms. Beatrice Santos never committed any kind of betrayal or immoral conduct, that the child she carries is the legitimate offspring of the marriage. But this case, with due respect to the court, far transcends the simple biological question of paternity. She made a calculated pause, allowing the weight of the words to settle in the room. During the last 2 weeks, at the request of the defense, a detailed forensic investigation was carried out into Mr. Henry Thompson's financial and documentary situation. And what we discovered, Your Honor, are extremely serious irregularities that directly affect not only the division of assets in this divorce proceeding, but also the very credibility and legality of the accusations made against my client. Mr. Sterling rose abruptly, interrupting. Your Honor, this is absurd. We are dealing with a divorce case, not a criminal investigation. The defense is clearly trying to divert attention, create a smokescreen to confuse the court. Dr. Eleanor Vance maintained a serene but firm tone. We are dealing with truth, counselor. And truth, as you yourself said in the previous hearing, is not made with emotional appeals, but with facts. And facts have layers. The court may choose to ignore them, but they will remain there, irrefutable. The judge raised her hand, requesting silence. She looked long at the documents Dr. Eleanor Vance had placed on the table, then at Henry, who avoided her gaze, and finally at the lawyer. What kind of irregularities? We request the inclusion of new forensic reports in the proceedings, Your Honor, including extended genealogical DNA analysis and a complete and retroactive tax audit of Mr. Henry Thompson's declared and undeclared assets. We have sufficient preliminary evidence to justify this investigative expansion. The judge, after a long pause that seemed to stretch for entire minutes, nodded affirmatively. Granted. The hearing is suspended for an additional 3 weeks for a complete forensic analysis. Both parties will be formally notified. When the session was adjourned, Henry left the room visibly pale, stumbling. Clarissa followed him in sepulchral silence, without the studied smiles of previous appearances. For the first time, the armor of his confidence had visibly cracked. In the following days, Marcus Rivers worked with obsessive intensity, sleeping few hours a night. He discovered systematic bank transfers to accounts in offshore tax havens, Cayman Islands, Panama, Luxembourg, million-dollar investment funds registered in the name of shell companies, whose partners were straw men, or in some cases, Clarissa. And finally, the final blow, a multi-million-dollar private trust that Henry had meticulously built over 10 years, using assets that legally should have been declared as marital property. It was tax evasion, concealment of assets, procedural fraud. But there was something more, something Marcus discovered almost by chance by cross-referencing genealogical data requested by Dr. Eleanor Vance with old public records. He called the lawyer on a Friday night, voice tense. You need to see this personally. I can't talk on the phone. In the office. Marcus opened his laptop and showed the results of the extended genealogical DNA analysis they had judicially requested. Cross-referencing Henry's DNA with preserved biological samples of Arthur Thompson, collected years earlier in a medical procedure and legally stored. There is no genetic match. 0. Henry Thompson is not the biological son of Arthur Thompson. Dr. Eleanor Vance felt the impact of the words like a punch to the gut. She read the numbers, the comparative tables, the correspondence graphs. Everything pointed to the same irrefutable conclusion. The multi-million-dollar inheritance that sustained Henry's empire, all the fortune, all the prestige, all the social power he wielded as a weapon, all stemmed from a meticulously orchestrated documentary fraud decades earlier. It was not the legitimate son. It was an imposter. This changes absolutely everything, the lawyer murmured. The third hearing was scheduled for a Monday in November. The room was more crowded than usual. Detailed rumors about the case had leaked to legal circles and, inevitably, to the local press, which sent discreet but attentive reporters. Judge Helen Carter entered the room with a very serious expression, carrying not only the case file, but additional volumes of forensic documents. Before any formal declarations from the parties, the judge took the floor. This hearing will address matters that significantly exceed the initial scope of this divorce proceeding. I request that all present maintain absolute silence and respect. Dr. Eleanor Vance, you may proceed. The lawyer rose, took a deep breath, and began with a firm but controlled voice. Your Honor, members present today, we present a robust set of documentary, forensic, and testimonial evidence that reveals not only systematic asset fraud, but also falsification of public documents dating back more than 3 decades. Mr. Henry Thompson built his fortune, social position, and power of intimidation on a false paternity, irregularly registered 30 years ago for reasons that are still being investigated by the competent authorities. She made a brief pause, allowing the gravity of the accusations to be absorbed. The genealogic reports presented in this case confirm, with absolute scientific certainty, a total absence of genetic correspondence between Henry Thompson and Arthur Thompson, the deceased businessman who was supposedly his biological father. The billion-dollar inheritance he received, the assets he manages, the companies he controls, everything is based on a false document. Mr. Sterling tried to interrupt, but the judge silenced him with a severe gesture. Doctor, Eleanor Vance continued, now slightly raising her tone, with a rhetorical technique that blended objective data with moral appeal. But this courtroom was the scene of something even more serious. It was the scene of a systematic, calculated, and cruel attempt to destroy the reputation of a pregnant woman. It was the scene of meticulously orchestrated lies, refined emotional manipulation, and institutional abuse of power. It was the scene of a man who, knowing deeply that his own identity was built on fraud, decided to mercilessly attack the integrity of others to protect his dark secrets. The silence in the room was sepulchral. Henry was pale, motionless as a statue. Clarissa was no longer by his side. She had left the courtroom moments before the start, advised by her own lawyers that it would be better not to be present. Judicial procedures, Your Honor, exist to serve people, to protect rights, to seek truth, not to destroy them, not to be used as weapons of intimidation. And when they are perverted in this way, it is the ethical and legal duty of this court to disarm them, dismantle them, and restore the dignity that has been violated. The judge formally requested the complete reports. She read each document in absolute silence, page by page, for almost 40 minutes. The room remained in suspense. When she finished, she looked up directly at Henry. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to declare in your defense? Henry tried to speak, but his voice failed him initially. He cleared his throat, drank water with trembling hands. Mer Sterling touched his arm, whispering something, but Henry pushed his hand away with an abrupt gesture. I didn't know initially. My father, Arthur, registered me when I was a baby. I grew up believing I was his son. I only discovered the truth years later, when I had already inherited everything. But at that point, there was no turning back. The judge did not avert her gaze. Her voice was cold, cutting. You didn't know, but you consciously used the fraudulent inheritance. You didn't know, but you built a business empire. You didn't know, but you systematically defamed your legitimate wife, the mother of your daughter, to protect an estate that was never rightfully yours. You turned this courtroom into a stage for cruel theater. She closed the folder with a snap. I order the immediate reversion of all fraudulently inherited assets to the legitimate estate of Arthur Thompson, with full and priority compensation to Ms. Beatrice Santos for moral, material, and psychological damages, exclusive and definitive custody of the minor Aurora, already born according to recent procedural information, commencement of criminal proceedings for falsification of public documents, aggravated misappropriation, and procedural fraud. This hearing is adjourned. The gavel struck with a sharp, dry thud. Henry slumped into the chair, covering his face with his hands. Mer Sterling quickly gathered his papers, clearly disoriented. Beatrice, holding Aurora in her arms, born 2 weeks earlier. Healthy and perfect, felt tears roll down, but they were not of sadness. They were of liberation. 3 months after the final judgment, Beatrice inaugurated the Aurora Center, a space for legal, psychological, and social support for victims of emotional manipulation and legal proceedings. The name was a tribute to her daughter, but also a symbol. Aurora, a new beginning, light after darkness, The criminal case against Henry followed its slow but inexorable course through the judicial system. He had lost not only the company and his assets, but all the reputation built over decades. Clarissa had been formally indicted for active participation in tax fraud, money laundering, and asset concealment. The secret trust Marcus had discovered proved to be just the tip of a much larger criminal enterprise, involving other individuals, other families, decades of sophisticated financial crimes. Dr. Eleanor Vance became a permanent and volunteer counselor at the Aurora Center, dedicating weekly hours to training new lawyers in defense techniques against procedural manipulation. Marcus Rivers, the forensic accountant who had uncovered everything, took on the role of a specialized volunteer, offering free consultation for complex cases. One rainy March day, while organizing the documents of her own case to transform them into educational material for the center's workshops, Beatrice found an old note that Dr. Eleanor Vance had made during their first consultation, months earlier. Procedures exist to serve people. Now, holding that yellowed paper, she finally understood the depth of the phrase. Insidious legal, bureaucratic, institutional, or neutral tools. They could build or destroy, protect or attack, liberate or imprison, depending exclusively on who wielded them, and with what intention. And the truth, however much it was delayed, distorted, attacked, or buried, remained intact, patiently waiting until it found someone brave enough to uphold it to the end. The Aurora Center grew rapidly. In 6 months, it had served over 200 women in similar situations. Some won their cases. Others lost legally but gained something more valuable, the restoration of their own dignity, the certainty that they fought, the refusal to remain silent. Judge Helen Carter, deeply impacted by the outcome of the case, began to cite Beatrice's story in national lectures on judicial ethics and system reform. Justice is not always swift, she would say to auditoriums packed with magistrates and law students. But when it is true, when it is built on solid evidence and human compassion, it transforms not only individual lives, but entire social structures. A single case can change jurisprudence. A single ruling can inspire generations. Months later, on a sunny Saturday, Henry requested through lawyers to visit Beatrice. Not to ask for forgiveness, he understood there were no words sufficient for that, but to personally deliver a letter he had written during sleepless nights in the prison where he awaited criminal trial. Beatrice agreed to receive him at the Aurora Center, accompanied by Dr. Eleanor Vance. He entered downcast, aged 10 years and a few months, wearing simple clothes. He handed her the envelope with trembling hands. "I don't expect you to read it now, nor to respond. I just needed you to know that everything is written there. The whole truth. Not as a justification, there is no possible justification, but as a historical record." Beatrice took the letter, observed the envelope for long seconds, then put it in her purse without opening it. She looked into his eyes for the first time in almost a year. "The truth never belonged to me, Henry, and it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to everyone affected by your choices. This letter changes nothing of what happened, but it can help others understand how systems of power are built on lies. That's why I'll keep it." He nodded, speechless, and left. Beatrice felt neither anger nor satisfaction seeing him leave, bowed and defeated. She felt only clarity, the end of a cycle. Aurora grew up hearing the story little by little, in age-appropriate doses, not as a Shakespearean tragedy, but as a life lesson. The truth doesn't belong to whoever speaks it first or loudest, but to whoever upholds it with courage and persistence to the end, even when the whole world seems to conspire against it. One winter afternoon, 5 years later, Beatrice was invited to give a lecture at a law school. At the end, a young student raised her hand. "How did you find the strength to continue when all seemed lost?" Beatrice smiled, holding the hand of Aurora, now a curious and intelligent 6-year-old girl. "It wasn't about finding strength. It was about refusing to surrender my narrative to those who wanted to destroy it. It was about remembering every day that procedures exist to serve people, and when they are perverted, it is our duty, each one of us, to reclaim that original purpose." The audience applauded for a long time, but the most important applause came from little Aurora, who held her mother's hand tightly and whispered, "I'm proud of you." And at that moment, Beatrice understood that true restoration was not in judicial rulings or financial reparations, but in the possibility of rising after a fall and transforming pain into a seed of collective dignity. If this story touched your heart and sparked reflection, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon to follow more stories that celebrate truth, justice, and human dignity. Share in the comments, what would you do in Beatrice's place? Your voice matters and can inspire others. Until the next journey of transformation and hope.